The call came into the White House on the morning of April 5, 1964. Lyndon Johnson was in the middle of his daily briefing when an aide quietly entered the Oval Office with the news: Douglas MacArthur was dead. Johnson stopped mid-sentence, absorbed the information, and within hours had mobilized the full machinery of the federal government to orchestrate what would become one of the most elaborate state funerals in American history. Johnson's immediate response revealed something deeper than protocol. He ordered flags lowered to half-staff across the nation and all military installations worldwide. He designated MacArthur to lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda, an honor reserved for the nation's most distinguished figures. He announced he would personally attend the funeral services, and he directed his staff to prepare remarks that would memorialize MacArthur not just as a soldier, but as an American icon. For a president juggling the Civil Rights Act, an escalating situation in Vietnam, and the upcoming 1964 election, this level of attention to a funeral was extraordinary. Johnson's public statement came swiftly. He described MacArthur's death as a loss to the entire free world. He spoke of MacArthur's gallantry, his military genius, and his devotion to duty. The statement praised MacArthur's role in defeating Japan, his administration of the occupation, and his service spanning 2 world wars and Korea. Johnson called him one of the greatest military leaders of our time, and noted that the nation mourned a genuine hero. The language was elevated, formal, and unreservedly laudatory. But understanding why Johnson responded this way requires understanding both men and the moment in which MacArthur died. Johnson had been president for less than 5 months, having assumed office after John F. Kennedy's assassination in Dallas the previous November. He was governing in Kennedy's shadow, trying to establish his own legitimacy while maintaining continuity with his predecessor's policies. Vietnam was becoming increasingly complicated, with American advisors on the ground and pressure building for greater involvement. Johnson needed to project strength and decisiveness, particularly on military matters. MacArthur represented something powerful in the American imagination in 1964. Though Eisenhower and Omar Bradley were still living, MacArthur was the most storied of the remaining 5-star giants. His controversies with Truman had faded, replaced by nostalgia for the Pacific victory. For Johnson, who had worn a Silver Star pinned to his chest by MacArthur himself during the war, honoring the general was more than protocol. It was an alignment with a legend. Having seen how the clash with MacArthur had crippled Harry Truman's presidency, Johnson was determined to make this final chapter one of unity, not division. The state funeral Johnson organized was massive in scale. MacArthur's body was transported from New York to Washington, where it lay in state at the Capitol Rotunda for public viewing. Hundreds of thousands of Americans filed past the casket over 2 days. Johnson attended the memorial service at the Capitol, sitting with congressional leaders, Supreme Court justices, and foreign dignitaries. The ceremony included full military honors, with representatives from all service branches present. It was a display of national unity and respect that reflected the significance Americans attached to MacArthur's service. Johnson's remarks at the Capitol service were carefully crafted. He spoke of MacArthur's courage, his strategic brilliance, and his unwavering commitment to freedom. He referenced MacArthur's famous return to the Philippines, his leadership in the Pacific Theater, and his successful administration of occupied Japan. Johnson made no mention of Korea or the controversy with Truman. This wasn't the time for division or debate. Johnson understood that funerals serve purposes beyond mourning, and MacArthur's funeral became an occasion for national unity and reflection on military service. But there was more to Johnson's response than protocol. MacArthur's death came at a moment when Johnson was making crucial decisions about Vietnam. American involvement was deepening. The Gulf of Tonkin incident would occur just 4 months later, in August, leading to the resolution that gave Johnson broad authority to escalate military action. Johnson was consulting with military advisors about strategy, force levels, and objectives. MacArthur's approach to war, total commitment, clear objectives, overwhelming force, was part of the broader conversation about military strategy, even if not explicitly referenced in every discussion. Interestingly, MacArthur himself had offered advice on Vietnam that contradicted his own historical image as a hawk. In the early 1960s, MacArthur had counseled against large-scale American ground involvement in Southeast Asia. He had told Kennedy that trying to fight a land war in Asia was folly, that the terrain and political situation made victory impossible. This advice, coming from the general who had wanted to expand the Korean War into China, surprised many observers. MacArthur had learned something from Korea, even if he never publicly acknowledged his errors there. Johnson was aware of MacArthur's warnings about Vietnam, though how much weight he gave them is unclear. By 1964, the momentum toward escalation was building from multiple sources: military advisors, congressional hawks, anti-communist ideology, and Johnson's own determination not to be the president who lost Southeast Asia. MacArthur's death meant that one potential critic with military credibility was no longer available to comment on Vietnam policy, though whether he would have spoken out more forcefully had he lived remains unknown. The state funeral also served Johnson's domestic political needs. The Civil Rights Act was working its way through Congress, facing fierce Southern opposition. Johnson, a Southerner himself, was managing a delicate coalition of Northern liberals and moderate Republicans against segregationist Democrats. Honoring MacArthur, a figure who transcended partisan divisions and regional loyalties, gave Johnson a moment to present himself as a national leader rather than a partisan figure. MacArthur's body was then transported to Norfolk, Virginia, for the final funeral service and burial. Johnson did not attend the Norfolk service, but he sent Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy as his representative, along with a large delegation of government and military officials. The service at St. Paul's Episcopal Church was followed by burial in the MacArthur Memorial, a fitting end for a man who had spent his life in service and had carefully crafted his own legacy. Johnson's handling of MacArthur's death demonstrated his understanding of presidential ceremony and public ritual. He recognized how to use national ceremonies to advance broader purposes while appearing to serve larger national interests. He understood that Americans needed heroes, especially in uncertain times, and that honoring those heroes reflected well on the president who did the honoring. The funeral followed established protocols for state ceremonies, with extensive planning for the public events. Yet there was genuine respect in Johnson's response, too. Whatever MacArthur's flaws and controversies, his service was real and significant. He had commanded in battle, administered a defeated enemy with wisdom, and embodied military excellence for millions of Americans. Johnson had spent his career around powerful men, and he recognized MacArthur's stature. The praise Johnson offered reflected admiration for military achievement and sacrifice. The contrast with Truman's response was stark. Truman had been measured and diplomatic, but notably brief in his public comments. He hadn't attended the funeral. His statement acknowledged MacArthur's service without dwelling on it. Truman had fired MacArthur and never regretted it, and his response to the general's death reflected that history. Johnson had no such baggage. He could embrace MacArthur fully, using the funeral to strengthen his own position as commander-in-chief. The timing of MacArthur's death was significant in another way. The 1964 presidential election was approaching, with Johnson running for a full term against Republican Barry Goldwater. Goldwater would run as a hawk, advocating aggressive military action against communism and criticizing Johnson's gradualist approach to foreign policy. By honoring MacArthur so prominently, Johnson reinforced his own military credentials and made it harder for Republicans to paint him as soft on defense. Johnson's response aligned with the public mood of the moment. Johnson's approach to Vietnam would ultimately follow a path MacArthur had warned against: the gradual escalation, the limited objectives, the restrictions on military action, all resembled the strategy MacArthur had despised in Korea. But Johnson felt constrained by circumstances. He believed withdrawal would lead to communist victory and destroy American credibility. He believed all-out war risked Chinese intervention and nuclear confrontation, so he chose the middle path, the limited war, the strategy of containment rather than rollback. It would ultimately fail, destroying his presidency and costing tens of thousands of American lives. Whether MacArthur's advice on Vietnam would have mattered if he had lived longer is impossible to say. By 1964, he was 84 and had been out of power for 13 years. His influence had waned significantly. The military establishment had moved on to a new generation of leaders who had absorbed different lessons from World War II and Korea. MacArthur's romanticized vision of warfare, clear objectives, total victory, unconditional surrender, seemed increasingly out of step with an age of nuclear weapons and limited wars.
But MacArthur's funeral gave Johnson a chance to invoke that vision without committing to its implications. He could praise MacArthur's clarity and decisiveness while pursuing policies that were quite different. He could honor the warrior while conducting warfare in ways the warrior would have questioned. It was a tension Johnson never had to resolve because MacArthur wasn't there to engage with current policy debates. The coverage of MacArthur's death and funeral dominated American media for days. Newspapers ran lengthy retrospectives on his career. Television networks provided live coverage of the ceremonies. Magazines published special issues analyzing his legacy. The American public responded with genuine emotion, reflecting both respect for MacArthur's service and nostalgia for a time when American power seemed unlimited and American purposes seemed pure. Johnson's response reflected this national sentiment. In his private moments, Johnson's thoughts about MacArthur remain harder to assess. Johnson wasn't given to extensive diary keeping or philosophical reflection in writing. His phone conversations, later released, show him focused on practical political matters rather than historical reflection. But people who knew Johnson described him as someone who revered power and achievement, and MacArthur embodied both. Johnson likely saw in MacArthur qualities he wanted associated with his own presidency. The question of what MacArthur would have thought of Johnson's Vietnam policy is intriguing. MacArthur's late career warnings against land wars in Asia suggested he had learned from Korea's frustrations. But his fundamental belief in military victory over political compromise hadn't changed. He might have counseled either staying out entirely or going all in with overwhelming force. The gradual escalation Johnson chose would likely have struck MacArthur as problematic. Enough involvement to get Americans killed, not enough to achieve decisive results. Johnson's commemoration of MacArthur also served to rehabilitate the general's image after the Truman controversy. By giving MacArthur full state honors and praising him unreservedly, Johnson helped cement the narrative that MacArthur had been a great American hero whose clash with Truman was an unfortunate but resolved controversy. This approach aligned with Johnson's need for military support as he navigated Vietnam policy. The funeral arrangements reflected Johnson's attention to detail and his understanding of visual politics. Every element of the ceremony followed established protocols while creating a powerful public spectacle. Johnson had observed Kennedy's funeral just months earlier and understood how these ceremonies shaped public perception. He applied those observations to MacArthur's funeral, creating events that reinforced American strength and unity at a moment when both were increasingly fragile. MacArthur's funeral included multiple services and extensive military pageantry. The procession through Washington featured honor guards from all branches of service. Artillery salutes were fired. Military bands played funeral marches. The flag-draped casket was transported on a horse-drawn caisson, evoking traditions that stretched back to Lincoln's funeral. These elements combined traditional military honors with the modern media coverage that could broadcast them to millions of Americans.
Johnson's presence at the Capitol service was significant. Presidents don't attend every state funeral, and Johnson's schedule was extremely demanding. His decision to attend personally, to deliver remarks, and to be photographed mourning with the nation sent a clear message about MacArthur's importance and Johnson's respect for military service. The images of Johnson standing solemnly during the ceremony appeared in newspapers across the country. The religious elements of the funeral were also notable. MacArthur had been an Episcopalian, and both the Capitol service and the Norfolk funeral included traditional Christian liturgy. Johnson, a member of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, participated in these services, demonstrating the role of religious ceremony in American public life. The prayers, hymns, and scripture readings placed MacArthur's death in a spiritual context that resonated with many Americans. Foreign dignitaries attended the funeral as well, reflecting MacArthur's international stature. Representatives from countries MacArthur had liberated or defended during his career came to pay respects. Japanese officials attended, a remarkable gesture given that MacArthur had commanded the forces that defeated Japan and then ruled the country during occupation. Their presence testified to MacArthur's success in transforming former enemies into allies. The burial at Norfolk placed MacArthur in the city where he had asked to be interred. The MacArthur Memorial, which houses his tomb, would become a museum and research center dedicated to his life and career. Johnson's government supported this memorial, recognizing its value in preserving military history and honoring American service. The memorial continues to operate today, maintaining MacArthur's papers and artifacts from his long career. Johnson's public statements in the days following MacArthur's death continued to emphasize themes of duty, honor, and sacrifice. He spoke at several events about the importance of military service and the debt Americans owed to those who defended the nation. These themes served Johnson's immediate political needs while also reflecting genuine American values. The connection between MacArthur's honored service and current military commitments in Vietnam was left implicit but clear. The contrast between how Johnson handled MacArthur's death and how he would later leave office is striking. In 1969, Johnson departed the presidency as a deeply controversial figure, his Vietnam policies having torn the nation apart. He chose not to run for re-election in 1968, announcing his decision in a nationally televised address. He returned to Texas and died in 1973, less than a decade after MacArthur. His own funeral was significant, but occurred in a very different national mood than MacArthur's had. The parallels between MacArthur and Johnson became clearer over time. Both men possessed enormous talent and ambition. Both achieved significant accomplishments early in their careers. Both became embroiled in Asian wars that defied their expectations and damaged their reputations. Both were undone ultimately by the gap between their vision of American power and the complicated realities of guerrilla warfare, nationalist movements, and limited wars in the nuclear age. Johnson's elaborate response to MacArthur's death in 1964 honored a man whose career prefigured aspects of his own trajectory. MacArthur had experienced both triumph and controversy, had clashed with civilian leadership over military policy, and had seen his reputation undergo significant reassessment after leaving active service. Johnson would experience similar patterns, though the specific circumstances differed. Looking back, Johnson's response to MacArthur's death appears as a significant example of presidential leadership during national mourning. He understood the importance of ceremony, the power of symbols, and the need to honor military service. He positioned himself appropriately as commander-in-chief while allowing the focus to remain on MacArthur. He facilitated a national moment of unity and reflection during a period when such moments were becoming increasingly rare. The state funeral became part of MacArthur's legacy, shaping how Americans remembered him. The elaborate ceremonies, the presidential attention, the national mourning all contributed to a narrative of MacArthur as American hero whose controversies were overshadowed by his service. Whether this narrative was entirely accurate is debatable, but it was the narrative Johnson's response helped create. When Johnson died in 1973, the nation was still deeply divided over Vietnam. His funeral was respectful but lacked the unified national mourning that had characterized MacArthur's. The wounds were too fresh, the debates too raw. Johnson's legacy remained contested in ways that MacArthur's no longer was by 1964. Time had softened MacArthur's controversies. It hadn't yet done the same for Johnson's.
This video presents historical information compiled from presidential papers, memoirs, archival documents, contemporary news coverage, and scholarly biographies, including works by Robert Caro, David McCullough, William Manchester, and government records from the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library. All statements are based on documented historical sources. Historical interpretations may vary among scholars and historians. Viewers are encouraged to consult multiple sources for deeper research. This content is intended for educational purposes.